Hi, friends. Welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Salih Hudayar. Mr. Hudayar, thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule. Mr. Hudayar is the Foreign and Security Minister of East Turkistan Government-in-Exile, and we are going to talk about specifically, East Turkestan today, and especially in context of October 12th. Mr. Udyar, October 12 marks the day China invaded East Turkestan in 1949. So, how do you view this date as a representative of the East Turkestan government in exile? Is it a day of mourning? Is it a day of resistance? Or is it a day of renewed resolve for your people to get their country back?
Well, firstly, it's a day of national mourning for the people of East Turkestan, because this is the day China invaded East Turkestan. And even though when China invaded, our people resisted to the best of our abilities. I need to remind the international community and the people, the listeners, that before China invaded, the Soviet Union, especially Stalin and Mao, they had come to an agreement on occupying East Turkestan as early as August of 1949. And as part of that plan, the Soviet Union had called all the top senior ministers and officials of the East Turkestan Republic to a meeting in the Soviet Union. And so they went to the Soviet Union on August 24th, and they were essentially executed according to the memoirs of Sudoplatov, Pavel Sudoplatov. He in his 1998 book called Special Tasks, he was the head of the MKGB, which was essentially the Soviet KGB before it became known as the KGB. And he stated that they were executed after refusing to willingly give up East Turkestan's independence and join with the Chinese communists. So they staged a plane crash several days later on August 27th, 1949, stating that their plane crashed on the way to Beijing from the Soviet Union, and that their plane crashed over Siberia. And of course, this is completely fake. Our people have never accepted this. This was the real case, and everyone had suspected that they had been assassinated by the Soviet Union, and we only got that confirmation after the fall of the Soviet Union. Despite that, our people tried to resist as best we could, but China invaded on October 12th, and on December 22nd, 1949, roughly 2 months later, they overthrew the independent East Turkestan Republic and formally began its occupation.
So, currently, correct me if I am wrong, China calls it Xinjiang province, whereas it is actually basically East Turkestan. Now, over the past 7 decades, ever since China has occupied East Turkestan, so over the past 7 decades, how has China, systematically, in a very calibrated, cold-blooded manner, it has tried to erase East Turkestan's cultural, religious, and national identity? And now, what form of resistance is still there in that region or outside the region?
Yes, so the one of the first things that China began to do was call its invasion and subsequent occupation as so-called liberation, stating that it had liberated East Turkestan um, from, foreign imperialists, etc. When in reality, the only foreign imperialists that were in East Turkestan are the Chinese invaders themselves. And then to quash our people's desire to restore their independence, they played a game of "we will give you autonomy." And so in 1955, on October 1st, 1955, they designated East Turkestan as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And of course, this was just a pacifier to quash any desire for independence. However, our people rejected even this so-called unilateral designation of the autonomous region. In fact, our leaders at the time in East Turkestan, including those who had, served as leaders in the so-called autonomous region, they rejected that autonomy. In 1958, 1957, 1958, they sent several delegations to Beijing stating that, you need to uphold your original promise. Your original promise was within 3 to 5 years, you would help us develop a socialist society, and then you would withdraw. It's been over that period. We've developed a socialist society. The root of the problem here is Chinese chauvinism, and you are the invaders now, so you need to get out. And even Beijing's state media at that time highlighted the fact that our people, our leaders, rejected the so-called autonomy and wanted to restore East Turkestan's independence. And so in 1958, during the anti-rightist campaign, as the Chinese called it, they purged all the leaders in East Turkestan. Anyone who was wanting to restore East Turkestan's independence that were in the leadership, they purged them. But throughout the 1950s all the way till the 1970s, there was armed resistance guerrilla movement in East Turkestan. In fact, after the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, we had the largest attempts to organize within East Turkestan an armed resistance, and that was led by the East Turkestan People's Party. And that was the East Turkestan People's Party was headed by the so-called vice chairman of the autonomous region, who was also the deputy commander of the PLA in East Turkestan. But he was also the former military commander of the East Turkestan National Army. And so when they found out that he was behind this, the Chinese executed him in 1971. And then between the 1970s up until really the early 1980s, China had been able to, for a bit, quash any pro-independence resistance within East Turkestan. However, in the 80s, this resistance began to reemerge as a younger generation, as the previous generation that had been sentenced to prison. Some of them came out, were released after spending 15, 20 years in prison. And so they taught a younger generation. And throughout the 1980s, even if you look at the Chinese government's own records, most of these so-called counter-revolutionary and so-called national separatist activities and demonstrations, protests, and so-called rioting, as the Chinese government calls it, was carried out by teenagers as young as 10 years old up till 16 years old. And so in 1990, the last major armed uprising we had in East Turkestan was in 1990 in April, which erupted in the town of Baran on April 5th, lasting until April 11th, 6 days, across southern East Turkestan, not just in Baran, but many, many parts. And after that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, China began to worry about, potential international support for East Turkestan's cause. From the fall of the Soviet Union until really 1998, there was a lot of small scale, you could say, an insurgency that was developing in East Turkestan. There were a lot of armed attacks against Chinese military and security personnel, as well as their facilities. There was large-scale mass demonstrations and civil disobedience. And China essentially by 1998 had 1998, 1999 had quashed this. And even throughout after that, especially after 9/11, China began to claim that it was fighting against so-called Islamic terrorism, and that they tried to demonize our independence movement as a part of so-called global the fight against global terrorism. But despite that, our people continue to resist. There are still small-scale resistance efforts against the Chinese occupation forces. There were mass demonstrations, and of course, every time China would brutally crush this. Post 2014, China began to claim that it's waging a people's war against so-called terrorism, and this is where they initiated the ongoing genocide of our people. And as a result, much of our activism and our resistance in this front has, been out here in the West, peaceful resistance, raising awareness, advocacy for our people, for our people's, for the end of this genocide, for recognition and end of the genocide, as well as for decolonization and the restoration of East Turkestan's independence.
So why do you think the major powers in the world they don't confront China on the question of East Turkestan, whereas it is well known that a genocide is happening there. They are erasing the cultural identity of the people, and there is a brutal crackdown and violation of human rights. But why do you think the major powers in the world? So, or if I put it like this, what will it take these powers to take up this issue and confront China on the question of East Turkestan?
Well, one is the fact that these great powers, they don't understand the existential threat that China poses to their own national security and long-term sovereignty. This is the problem. They don't understand China. They don't understand China's threats. They think that by engaging with China, that by appeasing China, that they can make some form of deals and buy time. When in reality, what is happening is every time the global community appeases China, we're enabling China to grow even more stronger. The West, since the 1970s, pursued the foolish thing that, oh, if we open up to China, if we engage in economic and trade deals with them, China will grow into a democracy and it'll be beneficial. And look at the reality. China has not turned into a democracy. It's gotten even more authoritarian. It's gotten more powerful in terms of its economics and military and overall geopolitical power projection. China is rising while the international community, especially countries like the United States and Western countries, they're declining. Even Russia is declining. Russia used to be the 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 leader in terms of their relationship with China, the senior partner. Now Russia has become a junior partner. In fact, Russia is far east in Siberia. It's becoming new. It's essentially becoming colonized by China, and there's nothing that they're doing about it because again they have other problems and they're not focusing on the threat of China. So this is the biggest problem is they don't understand the threat of China. They don't understand that East Turkestan, China's control over East Turkestan and Tibet and southern Mongolia is vital for China's power projection. Um, thirdly, is they don't necessarily understand the fact that our people have a desire to, regain our independence, that we have an active resistance that needs to, just be supported a little bit more. And this is the problem is because in the media you think that the way that everything is portrayed is, oh, these are Chinese Muslims, this is a Chinese province, this is China's internal affairs. This is the narrative that is keeping them from doing that. But at the end of the day, the reality is because of the lack of will, because everything is being driven in terms of policies being driven by economics, by corporations who are doing business with China. And so they don't want their business interests hurt. And so they are sacrificing their own nation's long-term security and sovereignty for the temporary profits that they're making from Chinese businesses. But let's be honest, look at it. China is dominating in every sector. Where did that technology come from? Whether it's from AI, whether it's from the military sector, whether it's from, manufacturing or other sectors, where did all that come from? Because the West and other countries were like, oh, let's do business with China. This is what caused this problem. And there's a limited window of opportunity to push back against China. And this is why it's important for countries to support, one, to recognize that China is not a nation state. It is an empire. It is an empire built on the conquest of other nations, non-Chinese nations. So this is why the international community, if they are sincere about, human rights, about never again, about, justice and national self-determination, they need to recognize that their colonialism is still existing in the 21st century, and China is the biggest colonial power, and there needs to be decolonization of the Chinese empire. We need to support the rights and self-determination of Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia. We need to recognize that these are occupied nations and support their, right to national self-determination, using, the international institutions and international laws that allow for that. So this is one thing that needs to happen. Secondly, we need the West and the international community needs to recognize that continuing to do business with China, sure, it might be temporarily beneficial, but it has long-term negative consequences for the very security and sovereignty of those nations. And we're already seeing this through the Belt and Road Initiative. China has engaged in a debt trap of numerous nations. Many of them are forced to seize key parts of their territory over to China. And in the next coming decades, if this continues, many of them are going to be essentially puppet states of the Chinese regime. We're already seeing this in Pakistan. We're already seeing this in large parts of Central Asia. So it's a very big problem that the international community needs to address, because it's going to come to their backyard very soon as well if they don't stop it.
So now, Mr. Udayar, you have been part of this East Turkestan government in exile. So, if you could, tell us a little bit about what exactly this government is doing diplomatically, legally, politically to keep this independence movement of East Turkestan alive.
Yes, so after China had essentially crushed our independence movement in Central Asia, our leaders, our predecessors were able to secure, essentially, secure some tacit support from the West, to where we were able to establish our government in exile and survive here. And the whole point of our government in exile is to advocate for the restoration of East Turkestan's national independence and sovereignty, and to raise awareness and defend our people's rights at the international stage. So essentially, since we were formed in 2004, our government has been virtually the leading entity keeping the East Turkestan national question alive, keeping our people's desire for independence and liberty alive, whether that's through engaging with, governments, multilateral institutions, whether that's the UN or the other entities, as well as, the public, through media and other engagements. We have persistently been urging governments to, at the very least, stop, using the Chinese colonial term Xinjiang when referring to our country, to call it East Turkestan, and if they must call it Xinjiang, to write East Turkestan first and then in parentheses Xinjiang, explaining the fact that Xinjiang is a Chinese colonial designation, meaning the colony or the new territory. Secondly, to stop referring to our people as ethnic minorities or Chinese Muslims. We are not Chinese in any way. We are not ethnic minorities. We are still the majority in our own country. We are a distinct nation that has no cultural, linguistic, or any other form of ties with the Chinese. Thirdly, is to uphold their commitments to human rights, to self-determination, to decolonization. East Turkestan is essentially a colony under China right now, under Chinese occupation. So what we are pushing for is decolonization. If every nation has the right to self-determination under international law, and the people of East Turkestan have that same right, just as the people of any other country do. So we want the international community to ensure that there's no double standard. At the very least, we're calling on governments to treat us on the same level, on par with Tibet, to remove any double standard, because Tibet is recognized as Tibet. Whether China calls it Xizang or anything else, the international community always has consistently recognized it as Tibet. Almost everyone knows that Tibet is occupied by China. that Tibet used to be an independent country. Almost every country recognizes and supports the Tibetan people's right to national self-determination. So at the very least, we're asking the same thing on terms of East Turkestan. From the international, legal perspective, what we are trying to do is get justice and accountability for the ongoing genocide. To date, over a dozen Western countries, including the United States, and including the UN, have either recognized it as genocide or crimes against humanity or crimes against humanity. Yet it's been over 11 years since this genocide has started, but there has been no meaningful accountability. Our issue, we've received so much condemnation, so much statements of concern. There has been a few, low-level sanctions against Chinese officials and entities, as well as, highlighting reducing our issue to just a matter of forced labor. While we are grateful that the forced labor aspect and slave labor aspect is being highlighted, our issue it's not just a matter of forced labor and slave labor. So we have a case before the International Criminal Court, and we have been trying to urge governments, especially those that are member states to the Rome Statute, to refer our case, either have the UN refer it or those countries individually refer it to, and pressure the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to launch an immediate investigation and help us get some justice and accountability, because genocide is not going to stop by issuing condemnations or statements of concerns. You won't find any genocide in history that was stopped that way. Ultimately, the only solution for us is not autonomy, because we've been autonomous for the past 70 years. Under China's law, we've been autonomous since 1955. China just celebrated 70 years, and that so-called autonomy has brought extensive mass colonization to where we went from over 95% of the population in East Turkestan to less than 60% today, to where the Chinese grew from less than 4% to over 42% today. It's brought us genocide. Millions of our people have been enslaved, interned in prisons and concentration camp. Possibly millions of our people have been killed in these camps, and we won't know the whole truth until there is a whole level, international level investigation done, and this needs to be done sooner than later.
So on the eve of this anniversary of this tragic event which happened on 12th October 1949, so is there any final message you want to give to the international community, which and including the Chinese leadership also, about the future of East Turkestan and its people?
Yes. One, the international community needs to recognize that, needs to condemn and recognize that condemn the Chinese invasion and subsequent occupation, and recognize East Turkestan as an occupied country and the right of its peoples to national self-determination and decolonization. That's what the international community needs to do. They need to recognize that the root of our people's suffering, the ongoing genocide, the mass enslavement, the physical and cultural destruction of our people, our culture, our very identity and existence, is rooted in this day, in the day that China launched its invasion of East Turkestan. This is the root. So they need to address that. And furthermore, both to China and the international community, the people of East Turkestan have never accepted Chinese rule in any form, whether that's so-called autonomy, or any other terms that they might use. We will never accept that. For us, the only way for this Sino-East Turkestan conflict, or the East Turkestan-Sino conflict, to be resolved once and for all, is for China to respect our rights under international law. We can coexist with China. China can exist on its side of the Great Wall, as we have done for thousands of years, and we will exist in our country as neighbors, and we can continue to coexist like that as we have done for thousands of years. We're not against China's existence. China can exist in its own country. The Chinese people have a right to exist. They can exist within the Great Wall. Similarly, the East Turkestani people have a right to exist as a sovereign nation, and this is the only solution to this. And so if not, this is going to perpetuate a cycle, of violence. But this violence is being directed by the Chinese state, the Chinese colonial forces. And so we need to urge the international community again to push for the decolonization of the Chinese empire, to push for real justice and accountability for the atrocities, and to support the East Turkestani people's efforts to restore their independence and sovereignty.
Thank you so much, Mr. Udayar, for sharing your deep insights with us. And we'll continue to track the East Turkestan struggle for independence and East Turkestan movement. And we hope to host Mr. Udayar again very soon. So thank you so much for watching. And if you have any questions or any queries about the East Turkestan movement, you can share these questions or queries or your comments in the YouTube comment box, and we'll try and get answers for that. And thank you once again, Mr. Udayar, for
Thank you for
sharing.
having me.
Thank you.